We all know the UFC underpays fighters, especially with starting contracts at $10,000 to show, $10,000 to win. But have you ever really asked yourself why? Maybe they just don't have enough money. Well, let me give you an example that will blow your mind. At UFC 306 at the Sphere in Las Vegas, the worst floor seat, not the best, the worst, cost $12,000. One seat, $12,000. That means one chair was worth more than what a fighter who showed up, fought, lost, and potentially suffered brain damage would take home. Let that sink in for a moment. A piece of furniture generated more revenue than a human being putting their life on the line. So why is this happening? I'll give you two answers, one short, one long. The short answer, they don't need to pay more. The long answer, let's break down how the UFC became a monopolistic empire that controls every aspect of mixed martial arts. The golden era of competition. In the 2000s, MMA wasn't just the UFC. There was real, legitimate competition that created a healthy marketplace for fighters. Pride FC in Japan was arguably bigger than the UFC globally, with massive stadium shows and legendary fighters like Fedor Emelianenko, Mirko Cro Cop Filipovic, and Wanderlei Silva. Strikeforce in the US had champions like Nick Diaz, Gilbert Melendez, and Ronda Rousey before she became a household name. The WEC specialized in lighter weight classes and produced stars like Urijah Faber and Jose Aldo. Elite XC was putting MMA on network television with CBS, featuring Kimbo Slice in primetime. If you were a fighter back then, you had options, real options. And because you had options, the UFC had to pay competitively. It wasn't perfect. Fighter pay has always been an issue in MMA, but it wasn't a monopoly. Fighters could leverage offers from different promotions to get better contracts. They could build their brand in one organization and jump to another for more money. The free market was actually working. But instead of fighting the competition in the cage or in the marketplace, the UFC did what billionaires always do when faced with competition. They bought it. The systematic elimination. The acquisition strategy was brilliant and ruthless. Pride FC was bought in 2007 for a reported $65 million.
The UFC bought this company called Pride, and boy, did they get hoodwinked.
And immediately shut down. The UFC cherry-picked the best fighters and let the rest scatter to the wind. Years of Japanese MMA history and tradition were erased overnight.
The only two companies in this world that matter are the UFC and Pride. The UFC is coming here to kick your ass.
The Pride video library became UFC property, and one of MMA's greatest rivalries was eliminated with a signature on a contract. Strikeforce lasted longer, building itself into a legitimate competitor. They had a deal with Showtime, were developing homegrown talent,
the Strikeforce Heavyweight World Grand Prix,
and even snatched some UFC cast-offs who became champions. But in 2011, the UFC's parent company Zuffa purchased Strikeforce for an estimated $40 million. They kept it running for a while as a feeder league, then absorbed it completely in 2013. The WEC was actually already owned by Zuffa, but operated independently. In 2010, they folded it into the UFC, bringing the lighter weight classes into the main organization. Elite XC collapsed on its own in 2008 after financial mismanagement, but the UFC was there to pick up the pieces, signing fighters like Kimbo Slice and Jake Shields. One by one, the options disappeared. Dream, Sengoku, and other Japanese promotions tried to fill the Pride void, but couldn't capture the magic or the market share. When the dust settled, only Bellator was left standing as anything resembling legitimate competition. The Bellator illusion. At first, Bellator seemed like it could be a solid competitor. Founded in 2008, they had a unique tournament format, a television deal with MTV2 and later Spike TV, and were building young talent. When Viacom bought them in 2011, there was hope that corporate backing could create real competition for the UFC. They picked up whatever the UFC didn't want anymore. Rampage Jackson, Chael Sonnen
versus the bad guy,
Lyoto Machida, Rory McDonald. They had some genuinely elite fighters like Patricio Pitbull Freire, Michael Venom Page, Douglas Lima, and Gegard Mousasi. They weren't the UFC, but they were real. They kept some pressure on the system, gave fighters leverage in negotiations, and provided an alternative path for up-and-coming talent. But over time, Bellator fell apart. bad business decisions, terrible matchmaking that prioritized freak show fights over legitimate competition, and poor leadership slowly eroded their credibility. While Bellator crumbled from within, the UFC kept rising, especially during the Conor McGregor era of the mid-2000s. The McGregor years were transformative for the UFC's business model. Massive pay-per-views exceeding 1 million buys became regular occurrences. The sport went mainstream in a way it never had before. By the mid-2000s, the UFC wasn't just the biggest MMA promotion. It was the only MMA promotion that mattered on a global scale. Everything else was just leftovers, regional shows, or retirement homes for UFC veterans. The death of competition. Once the competition was effectively eliminated, everything changed fundamentally. The UFC didn't have to fight for talent anymore. They owned the talent pipeline. If you were a fighter with championship aspirations, you had two choices: sign with the UFC on their terms, or fade into obscurity fighting in high school gyms for a few $1,000s. Bellator tried to compete for a while longer, but it never reached the same level of relevance. And now Bellator is gone too, bought by the Professional Fighters League, FL, in 2023. Another so-called option off the table. The PFL itself, despite claims of being competitor, operates more as a complementary product than true competition, with their seasonal format and million-dollar tournaments for a select few while paying most fighters even less than the UFC. One championship in Asia has some excellent fighters, but focuses primarily on the Asian market. They've had financial struggles and don't offer a realistic alternative for most Western fighters. The UFC became the gatekeeper to fame, to money, to legacy. And when you control everything, you control the prices too. The pay structure scandal. Now yes, if you're a big name, Israel Adesanya, John Jones, Conor McGregor, or even rising stars like Paddy Pimblett, you're probably getting paid well. These fighters bring eyeballs, they move pay-per-view numbers, they sell tickets, they're valuable assets. And the UFC compensates them accordingly, though still far below what comparable athletes in other sports make. But for the rest, for the guys and girls trying to break through, the starting pay is the same garbage it's been for over a decade. That 10 and 10 structure, $10,000 to show up, $10,000 more if you win, has been in place since at least 2010. Think about that. In 2010, the average price of gas was $2.78 per gallon. The median home price in the US was $221,000. A Big Mac cost $3.73. Everything has gotten more expensive, but starting fighter pay hasn't budged. The $50,000 performance bonuses, same as they were back in the Brock Lesnar days over a decade ago. Meanwhile, the UFC's business has exploded exponentially. Pay-per-view prices have gone from $44.99 to $79.99. Gate revenues have tripled. The UFC sold for $4 billion in 2016 to WME-IMG, making the Fertitta brothers and Dana White incredibly wealthy. Dana White himself can't stop talking about breaking gate records. The gate for UFC 306 was $22 million. The UFC now holds multiple spots in the top highest gates of all time at various venues. The company is making 10 times what they were making in 2010. Revenue has grown from an estimated $300 million annually to over $1.3 billion in 2023. But fighters at the bottom? They're stuck at 10 and 10, the real math of fighter pay. Maybe you can live with the fact that the UFC is a business first, sport second. But the one thing that shouldn't slip through the cracks is the starting contract. That 10 plus 10 structure is disgusting. It's criminal. Let's do the real math that every aspiring fighter should understand. You fight for 10 and 10. You lose. You only get 10,000. First, you pay taxes, let's say 25% between federal and state. Now you're at $7,500. You pay your coach 10% of your gross, that's $1,000. You pay your management 20% of your gross, that's $2,000. You're left with $4,500. But wait, we're not done. You had to pay for your own training camp, 8 to 12 weeks of preparation, gym fees, sparring partners, maybe bringing in specialists. Conservatively, that's another $2,000. You had to pay for your own medicals to get cleared to fight, blood work, MRI, eye exams, That's another $500 to $1,000, depending on your state. You might have had to pay for your own travel for some of your cornermen. There goes another $500. When it's all said and done, you might walk away with $1,000 to $2,000 for 3 months of work that included getting punched in the face on national television. That's below minimum wage. It's literally better to beg on the street than to lose a UFC fight. A panhandler in a decent location can make more in 3 months than a losing UFC fighter. The control system. But it's not just about low pay. It's about control. Total, complete control. The UFC controls everything about a fighter's career. Who you fight, when you fight, where you fight, what you get paid, and even what sponsors you're allowed to have. Remember when fighters could wear their own sponsors in the cage? Fighters were making real money. 5 figures, sometimes 6 figures per fight from sponsorships alone. Guys like John Fitch reported making $100,000 per fight from sponsors. Even mid-tier fighters could get $20,000 to $50,000 from multiple sponsors on their shorts and banner. Then came the Reebok deal in 2015. Now the Venom deal. Only UFC-approved logos allowed. Fighters get a tiered payment based on how many UFC fights they've had, starting at $4,000 for newcomers and maxing out at $42,000 for champions. And guess who gets the real check from these deals? Not the fighters. The UFC signed a deal with Reebok worth a reported $70 million over 6 years. The Venom deal is reportedly worth even more. The fighters see a tiny fraction of that money. The pay-per-view scam. The UFC also controls pay-per-view money with a structure designed to minimize fighter payouts. You'd think if you're a champion and your fight sells 1 million pay-per-views at $79.99 each, you'd get a decent percentage, right? Wrong. Here's how the pay-per-view structure actually works. For the few fighters who even get points, from 0 to 200,000 buys, fighters get nothing extra.
Dana, give us the bonus. Give us the bonus.
From 200,000 to 400,000 buys, they might get $1 per buy. From 400,000 to 600,000, it goes up to $2 per buy. From 600,000 to 800,000, it's $2.50. And only above 800,000 do they get $3 per buy. So if your fight sells 1 million pay-per-views, instead of getting $3 million if it was a flat rate, you get 200,000 times $1 equals $200,000. $200,000 plus 200,000 times $2 equals $400,000 plus 200,000 times $2.50 equals $500,000 plus 200,000 times $3 equals $600,000. Total, $1.7 million. And that's only for champions and top stars. Most fighters get 0 pay-per-view points. Meanwhile, the UFC makes roughly $80 million from that one event between pay-per-view, gate, and sponsorships. The fighters, collectively, might see 15 to 20% of that revenue. In other major sports, athletes get 47 to 50% of revenue. The fear factor. Here's the thing. You can't complain. You can't speak out. Because if you do, you might never get booked again. The UFC has shown repeatedly that they'll punish fighters who speak out about pay, who criticize the company, or who don't play ball.
$50,000 is me, no house. It's a my dream, new house. Please, UFC!
This isn't just about fighter pay or sponsorships or contracts. It's about how the entire business is structured to benefit ownership at the expense of athletes. The UFC decides who gets signed, who gets pushed, who gets paid, who gets marketed. You don't negotiate like a free agent in other sports. You accept what's on the table, or you don't fight at the highest level. The solution? Today, if you don't like how the UFC operates, there's supposedly a simple solution. Go start your own MMA organization. No barrier to entry. Knock yourself out. Pay fighters whatever you want to pay them. But that's a false choice. The UFC has such market dominance that competing is virtually impossible. They have exclusive venue deals, exclusive television deals in many markets, and most importantly, they have the roster. They've created a situation where they're not just the best option, they're the only option that matters. So where does this leave us? The UFC is making more money than ever. The sport is growing, but fighter pay remains stagnant for all but the top stars. New fighters entering the UFC should know exactly what they're signing up for. It's not a partnership. It's not a fair split of revenue. It's a system designed to extract maximum value while paying minimum compensation. The UFC is basically a cartel, controlling supply, fixing prices, and eliminating competition. Maybe that's just how the fight business works. But when a single seat at an event costs more than what a fighter makes for putting their health on the line, something is fundamentally broken. Until fighters find a way to collectively bargain or legitimate competition emerges, nothing will change. The house always wins, and in MMA, the UFC is the house.